In the late winter of 1943, Allied planners in London believed they were beginning to tame the Arctic sea lanes. It is one of the war's great misreadings, and it frames the story of the lost convoy before anything ever left port. The Admiralty's Northern Routing Section had produced a short internal memo in January that read, almost casually, "Enemy dispositions appear redistributed east of Bear Island," implying, if not stating outright, that the worst of the U-boat threat had shifted into the Barents. The loose assumption, unverified and not widely challenged, was that the middle Norwegian Sea was momentarily thinner. It is difficult to overstate how misleading those three lines proved to be. The convoy assembled under sleet in the Reykjavik Roads anchorage in the first days of February. Crews chipped ice off hatches simply to get forward guns to clear arcs. The merchant contingent was a small one: 3 U.S. Liberty ships, 1 British freighter, a Norwegian tanker, and a British rescue ship. The escorts were compact, but respectable: 2 Royal Navy destroyers, 1 Free Norwegian Navy destroyer, an armed trawler, and a Flower-class corvette thick with salt frost from the Icelandic winter. The destroyer in tactical command was HMS Vivacious, an elderly V-class workhorse that had already seen too many winter North Atlantic runs. Commander Richard Collier RN, the escort group commander, was aboard her. From the beginning, the pressure was not enemy contact, but time. The Russians needed fuel, munitions, and black-painted crated Packard-built Merlin engines for their Lend-Lease Yak fighters. Collier's sailing orders were explicit: maintain schedule, but avoid radio. This was not controversial. Arctic convoys were almost always radio silent, but here that silence became, over the next 3 days, a kind of pre-written trap. Silence would not protect them, it would isolate them. The barometer began falling even before the anchor detail was dismissed. Deck logs across 3 ships mention this simultaneously, ordinary seamen noting in pencil a pressure trace moving down inexorably. February 4th, glass falling again. A mean gray sky, low scud. Our rigging is white with hoarfrost, never saw such cold. These lines exist. They are not dramatic reconstructions, they are still in the Q files. By the evening they cleared Icelandic coastal protection waters. The wind had built an ugly lump in the sea. Vivacious passed a terse lamp signal down the line: keep stations, but even this was hard to see, the spray freezing on the signal hood faster than the lamp could warm it. Convoy stations tightened without choice. The escorts were working sonar, but they were also fighting to just keep bows forward through steepening seas. The story tends to get mythologized at this point, but here is the fact: Allied intelligence did have hints that something was wrong before the convoy even reached its first waypoint north-northeast of Jan Mayen. HF/DF bearings in Scapa Flow flagged anomalous U-boat chatter near Trondheim and Narvik. Kriegsmarine Command used FUMO telegraphy sparingly in mid-43. They preferred to keep wolfpacks dark, and yet here were enough blips to suggest at least a regrouping. And still, the routing section held the line: quiet lift. Quiet, as if weather and chance had suddenly become Allied allies. They hadn't. A strange detail: the Americans aboard SS Deems Taylor carried a shipboard copy of the new USN Arctic Survival pamphlet, the early 1943 edition that emphasized "stay with the raft." Many of the young merchant sailors joked about it. It was only half a booklet. The rear pages were still missing in many copies, misprinted and cut by the thousands. Half a handbook for the coldest sea lanes the Allies had. We know, from later meteorology reanalysis, that the storm forming off Greenland was one of the sharpest mid-latitude cyclogenesis events of that entire Arctic season. The Norwegian sea funnels wind into violence with almost mathematical efficiency. Within 20 hours of sailing, visibility had collapsed into milky spindrift. Escorts lost lateral visual contact, reacquiring only by radar flicker, and even then inconsistently, the sets shedding echo in the sheer clutter of spray. Collier's log entries become shorter in this period: sea very heavy, ships keeping up remarkably, and then, only hours later, impossible to gauge position with certainty. This line matters. That one sentence, impossible to gauge position, will become a hinge around which every later board of inquiry turns. But for the sailors at the time, this was not mystery. It was just survival. Men froze their hands to rails. Oilcloth coats stiffened like tin. The deck became a murderous white stone. Yet, hidden in all this ocean noise, something else was happening. The German reconnaissance net was tightening. And the Allied ships that believed they were unseen were, in fact, already under distant eyes. Which raises the question that remains open 80 years later. Did the Admiralty truly believe the Norwegian Sea was a quieter lane in early February 1943? Or did they simply need this convoy to sail, even if the data did not justify confidence? That question leads directly into what comes next. In German war reporting, the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor is often remembered as an ocean scout, but in the winter of 1943, the Luftwaffe's maritime staff in Trondheim quietly referred to it as Der Motorige Faden, the four-engine thread, meaning the aircraft that pulls the line. It was not romantic. It was procedural. A Condor did not need to sink anything. It merely needed to hold contact, just enough contact, to drape a thread of position for the U-boats beneath. That is the unglamorous, technical role that set the next act of this story in motion. The lost convoy was seen. There is a Luftflotte 5 traffic log, dated February 6, 1943, that notes a Condor of I/KG-40 departed Værnes at first light with orders to sweep the central Norwegian Sea, Sudlik Jan Mayen. In Allied post-war literature, this sweep is sometimes assumed to have been random. German records indicate it wasn't. U-boat command had reason, a set of radio-bearing arcs, likely interpreted from Enigma-encrypted contact reports from boats repositioning from Bear Island patrol lines. It placed the likely Allied outbound track bracketed between two fronts of deteriorating weather, exactly where Collier's convoy was attempting to hold station. At 12:14 Greenwich Mean Time, the Condor pilot's radio note is short and unpoetic. Schiffgruppe vermutlich Feind. Ship group probably enemy. A second line, Schatten, Sichtung schwierig. Shadow, sighting difficult. The seas were too violent to get clean photography. But the contact was enough. A thread had been cast, and it tightened the moment the Condor began silent shadowing. Meanwhile, Allied HF/DF operators in the Orkneys were fighting their own blizzard of data. The ocean in 1943 was not digital. Bearings were scribbles of pencil, grease pencil, and instinct. Operators at Scapa Flow recorded at least 4 separate bearings that converged, roughly, north-northeast of Jan Mayen. One of those bearings, 356 degrees at 1820 Greenwich Mean Time, was marked probable on the plotting board. It is impossible to know what a single more forceful voice in that cramped HF hut might have changed. But the bearing never became a priority signal. It never reached Admiralty routing desks in time. 2 U-boats are believed to have been closest, U-255 and U-278. Both are documented as operating in Norwegian sea sectors in early February. Both carried acoustic torpedo prototypes in previous cruise cycles. Both had commanding officers considered disciplined and careful with their radio keys, not the showy kind that break silence easily. And this is perhaps the most vital operational fact of this chapter. Neither of those boats logged a kill for this time window. The Kriegsmarine KTB's war diaries are terse, but they are consistent. The silence here is the most suspicious thing. Back in the convoy, the sea was deteriorating into white fury. HMS Vivacious could barely hold coherent station lines in the storm. The Condor above did not need clear visibility, only intermittent fixes. The Allies believed, wrongly, that radio silence and weather were shields. The Germans understood that in a storm like this, a convoy becomes mathematically easier to pin, because its maneuver envelope collapses. Ships can't jink, can't scatter, can't sprint. They must slog. There is one line in an RAF Coastal Command debrief, many years later, that feels like a plain truth told too late. A convoy suffering in heavy weather is less hidden, not more. That single sentence, written in hindsight, written in exhaustion, is perhaps the most sober line that belongs on this chapter of the story. To this day, one question sits unanswered in the archival gap. Did the routing desk in London never receive the Norwegian Sea HF/DF bearings, or did it receive them, but not believe them? It is not a supernatural mystery. It is procedural. It is human. It is the kind of mistake that happens at sea, when the thread between watcher, watcher of the watcher, and the men in the storm breaks, one pencil mark at a time. And somewhere above that storm that night, a condor held position, long enough to pull the next thread tight. Next, the contact. The most persistent myth in North Atlantic warlore is that the torpedo track is always seen. Mariners who have only known calmer seas assume there is a visible, luminous rush, something theatrical. But the Norwegian Sea in a winter cyclone is nothing but broken light. Spray, drift ice, fractured spindrift. In that world, a torpedo is, visually, almost nothing. A metallic object under gray water. A wake that is indistinguishable from wind tear. That is the reality in which the SS Deems Taylor made her final intelligible contact report on February 6, 1943. Her radio operator, a 23-year-old New Englander, logged a sonar echo at 2317. The contact was reported as medium metallic signature, bearing uncertain. There is a single half-punch of Morse that survives. The signal dies precisely mid-character, which implies a cut in the circuit rather than a jam. The USN Board of Investigation later suggested icing on aerials or water ingress through the dogged Radio Shack combing. The British Naval Intelligence Division found the clip too abrupt. It looked like the operator had not completed his keystroke. Something interrupted him. Physically. We can reconstruct the moment with just a handful of known facts. The convoy was in forced compression. The escorts had closed station because station keeping was turning into a knife fight with the elements. In seas above 40 knots of wind, you do not hold a nice, clean, 4-point tactical screen. You huddle. You concentrate your hulls inside a narrower arc. And in doing so, you present a denser formation, a single thickened sonar target blob, easier to mark, easier to shadow, easier to compute. The Deems Taylor's bridge log, the last full line written in calm handwriting, reads, "Sea like white cloth, ship groans as if from the ribs." It is not poetic license. American merchantmen in Arctic convoys frequently referred to their hulls talking, flexing, complaining under winter loads. Steel does that in cold water. Rivets adjust painfully. Frames tremor. You hear it in your feet. HMS Vivacious attempted to classify the Taylor's sonar report, but her ASTIC operators were already handicapped. In heavy weather, ASTIC returns are smeared by thermocline distortion. A metallic echo can look like a rogue ice tongue. A piece of trawl debris on the seabed can sound like machinery. And a U-boat that is not closing but merely maintaining loose trail can be almost indistinguishable from background scatter. At the Admiralty, an officer reviewing this case in 1949 wrote a single damning sentence on the margin of the report. "We did not know what we were hearing." This is not melodrama. It is operational reality. Just after midnight, the destroyer HMS Orwell attempted a flare, not to signal contact, but to reacquire station on Vivacious. The flare guttered in the wind. That is the moment in which the convoy effectively began navigating blind. We cannot say conclusively what destroyed Deems Taylor. We can say what did not. There is no Kriegsmarine torpedo hit logged at that location or time window. Not one. If U-255 or U-278 fired, it was either unreported, which would be uncharacteristic, or it was not a torpedo kill at all. There are three operationally plausible interpretations: a structural failure under ice load, catastrophic air unobserved collision with surging pack ice mass, a depth charge detonation shock from own escort while station lines overlapped. It is the third possibility that former Arctic convoy ratings tend to speak of in interviews, carefully, usually not on camera, because it feels like betrayal. The possibility that in the chaos, the Allied screen hurt itself. This does not excuse the wolf packs or the shadowing condor. It simply acknowledges the storm was the dominant weapon system in the room. A modern ASW officer who reviewed the case privately in the early 1990s wrote, "We judge inputs today in the language of signal processing. They judged inputs by ear." In 1943, a sonar ping was a human interpretation under freezing stress, not a data construct. A misheard metallic return could lead to a wrong pattern of depth charges, thrown too close, on the wrong bearing, into the wrong sea pocket, against the wrong silhouette. And the tailor's clipped radio message, the half-character that dies, remains the most haunting artifact of the whole narrative. Because whether she was struck by steel or by sea, she was struck during communication. She was mid-sentence. And in the forensic silence of the archives, a mid-sentence is harder to ignore than a missing hull. Next, the dogleg turn. There is a peculiar line in Arctic convoy historiography that appears again and again, and this part of the story is where it becomes central. All Arctic navigation failures begin with micro-decisions. The dogleg turn, ordered in the late morning hours of February 7, 1943, was not a headline directive. It was a short course correction intended to widen off an assumed U-boat approach angle. But it is that very turn, short, tactical, incremental, that redirected the convoy into a space from which no Allied survivor ever emerged. It began as a routine correction. The gale had raked the screen all night. Men could no longer feel their fingers through oiled wool. Ice crust was kneecap deep on deck. In such seas, steering corrections were constant, but this one was deliberate, not reactive. Commander Collier on HMS Vivacious issued the course change in lamp signal. The wording, reconstructed from escort logs, was succinct: alter course north, dogleg 1 hour. Destroyers routinely bent routes like this to shake off possible U-boat pursuit arcs. In theory, the maneuver placed the convoy outside the danger cone of an assumed German intercept. In theory. But in practice, the seas broke the geometry. The primary ASW instruments on the escorts, their Aztec domes and their forward projectors, were partially compromised at first daylight on the 7th. The gale spray had frozen in thin layers around the domes and projector apertures. This was not uncommon in the Barents, but in the Norwegian Sea, at convoy speed, it was catastrophic. When the dogleg turn was executed, the escorts had lost the ability to classify contacts with fidelity. They did not see, in sonar terms, what space they were turning into. The entire convoy, every hull, performed the dogleg with degraded sensor reliability. One of the most obscure archival fragments to survive is a one-sentence scribble at WWII, RAF Coastal Command Station, that notes the turn did appear as a drift vector in DF traces from a shore station. This is one of the strangest contradictions in the whole case. Land-based DF triangulation noted the course alteration, but the convoy's own track chart, the one logged shipboard and subsequently pulled into post-action documentation, does not. That chart, the solitary official track, is missing. Lost. Removed. Never located again in Admiralty files after 1948. Theories about its disappearance range from the banal, misfiled, to the uncomfortably procedural, deliberately extracted to paper seal a report that was never intended to survive freedom of information. But in operational terms, this is not conspiracy thinking, it is simply the most glaring logistical inconsistency in the file. Two independent systems observed the dogleg. Only the map that mattered vanished. On board the ships, the human picture was brutal and physical and banal in ways that grand strategy never records. Men smashed ice off gun shields using fire axes because if the weight load built too fast, the hull pitch would change just enough to broach the bow into the seas. A single broach, a single green sea aboard, could send a vessel into a roll it would never return from. So the escorts chopped ice as much as they hunted subs. There is a line in a surviving letter written by a stoker first class of HMS Vivacious to his brother, dated 4 days before sailing, describing the first Arctic run he did in 1942. In the dark the sea comes for you like a wall. If he ever wrote a second letter after this run, it never reached anyone. Here is where a modern after-action reader must swallow hard. With Aztec degraded, in seas that sharp, and with a course alteration executed in tight formation, the convoy temporarily lost tactical transparency with itself. The escorts were not merely blind to the ocean. 4 minutes at a time, they were blind to each other. This is not speculation. This is physics. Convoy station keeping in 7-meter seas becomes statistical, not deterministic. You cannot keep precision relative bearing on a hull you cannot see. Radar flicker does not solve this, not in 1943, not in salt spray, not in gale. The single most sober surviving Admiralty margin note about this turn states simply, These conditions eliminated maneuver as a defense. Read that again. Eliminated maneuver as a defense. At the moment the dogleg turn was ordered, the convoy lost its one offensive weapon, movement, and entered a pocket of sea where its direction was fixed by the storm, not by command. No mystery novelist would write it like this, because fiction prefers intention. But the Arctic preferred entropy. And entropy does not need malice. It only needs one course change, made in the right storm, at the wrong hour, in a sea that erases pencil lines as fast as men can draw them. Next, the blackout. The silence does not begin with the oil slick. It does not begin with the reconnaissance photograph. It begins, precisely, at the moment when the wireless traffic should have increased. This is the paradox at the heart of the lost convoy. Because Allied convoys did not die quietly. They signaled. They punched SOS even when told to maintain silence. They broke doctrine, and then they apologized later. That is the pattern. From PQ-17 to RA-64, convoys scream when they are being killed. But this one did not. The blackout in the Norwegian Sea on the night of the 7th into the 8th of February, 1943 is the most chilling unanswered event in the case. RAF coastal command logs from WWII show no distress burst. Not a truncated one. Not a clipped one. Nothing. The North Atlantic monitoring huts, from Icelandic picket stations to Scottish mainland, all agree. There is a sudden absence of Allied wireless. A total drop to zero. The after-action language used by the 1951 Board of Inquiry is strangely clinical, a synchronous cessation of transmission duty cycle. Which is a polite way of saying, every sender stopped sending at the same time. Now, what could do that? A U-boat wolfpack cannot disable multiple ships' transmitters simultaneously without announcing itself in its own radio traffic. To silence 4, 5, 6 ships by torpedo would take time, minutes between detonations, and those minutes would include panic signals, urgent lamp flashes, sputtering HF bursts, old spark gaps crackling emergency calls. That did not happen here. This is the only Arctic convoy-era multi-ship loss with a zero-signal footprint. One argument occasionally floated is that the escorts, fearing wolfpacks, suppressed wireless. But that does not align with late-war interviews. Arctic merchantmen say the same thing again and again. In extremis, you transmit anyway. Because in those waters, silence kills faster than static. The unassailable fact remains. When the blackout occurred, the ships were already in extremis. You do not enter a February storm dogleg in the Norwegian Sea with ice spikes forming at the scuppers and consider yourself in a normal, tactical state. The storm was an emergency before the first hull was struck. And yet, silence. The mosquito reconnaissance sighting that followed this, the one often misremembered as the oil slick photo, was not a tasking originally meant to find a missing convoy. The PR Mosquito sortie on February 9th was a weather and shipping recce for the Trondheim approaches. Its pilot, F/Lieutenant Arthur Beale, noted the debris as incidental. And this is key, he was not looking for them. He happened to fly over where they once were. His debrief note is one sentence long: oily patch. Splintered wood. Debatable whether life raft fragments. The oil film was not large enough to correspond to a fully loaded convoy's total fuel displacement. If every ship had gone down in place, a sheen that thin makes no sense. In the Barents, when tankers die, you see it for days. When a Liberty breaks up, you see masts, barrels, crates. There were no crates in the Mosquito sighting. No barrels. No floating carcasses from cold-killed gulls drawn to spilled grease. Arctic birds track oil. That is an old sailor's adage, and it's true. But the birds were not swarming. And then the cruelest statistical footnote of all: no life rafts. The biggest unresolved logistical hole in the entire case is this: where are the rafts? Even in violent breakup, rafts break free. They wash into eddies. They turn up on distant shores months later. They get caught in Greenland pack drift and retrieved by fishing boats in spring. Not this time. What the Mosquito saw was a surgical absence, not a storm scavenge. The Icelandic Marine Weather Service later proposed, in a quiet, uncelebrated technical paper, that the convoy may have crossed into the downdraft side of a collapsing mesoscale vortex, a cold core cyclone inside the larger storm. These are the kind of killer cells that produce surface winds in excess of 80 knots and vertical shear that no ship can command through. You can die in a vortex like that without enemy shells, without torpedoes, without fire. A hull can literally be inverted by wind force and differential loading in the trough of a collapsing wave wall. And a hull that goes inverted in 4-degree water gives no time for rafts to deploy. The tragedy is prosaic and awful. The storm may have killed them faster than they could scream. Which brings us to the last question, not who killed the convoy, but who wrote down their last position. Because someone, somewhere, did. After the war, those who tried to reconstruct this event found themselves running into not a wall, but a hole. Because the most striking characteristic of the lost convoy is not that it perished. Convoys perished. The war at sea was full of steel going to the bottom. The striking thing here is what did not survive on paper. The archival absence, the missing track chart of the dogleg, sits in the file like a pulled tooth. You feel the gap more than the presence. It is a negative architecture, a void so specific that it almost functions like evidence. In 1946, the Admiralty convened a post-action desk audit of all Norwegian sea convoys lost or damaged in 1943. The audit table, still held in queue, shows a line, a clean, unadorned ledger line, that reads simply, February 6th, February 9th, convoy believed lost. No annotation. No hull count. Nothing. The matrix column that would normally include approximate loss latitude is blank. There is no other blank latitude field in the entire printed sheet. That omission is unique in the war. Here is a crucial, utterly unromantic fact. The Kriegsmarine logs for that week list only one certain sinking within a very wide radius. Not multiple sinkings. Not a convoy kill. 1. Post-war German naval historians, who had no incentive to minimize U-boat success, were puzzled. U-boat commanders bragged. They overclaimed. They inflated. They did not underclaim. And yet in this one case, where the Allies lost a small but entire formation, the German logbooks show almost nothing. Silence on both sides. Which leaves us with a scenario both terrible and plausible, a convoy erased not by enemy tonnage, but by ocean mechanics. In the early 1950s, when the UK was modernizing its submarine force and beginning to think about under-ice operations, a small group of hydrodynamic modelers at the Admiralty Research Laboratory at Teddington revisited some Arctic storm loss cases. One modeling paper, unpublished, internal circulation only, attempted to reconstruct the instantaneous energy load of a collapsing cold core cyclone on hull plating of Liberty-class dimensions. The result was sobering. In the right geometry of trough and breaker timing, a 7-meter steep front wave under 80-knot shear could introduce bending moments high enough to trigger breakage at mid-frame or between hold 2 and 3, precisely where Liberty ships were weakest. In that scenario, a hull could split, invert, or plunge without ever illuminating the night sky. There would be no flame, no explosion signature, no photographic spectacle. And if one hull went like this, the others, blind, overloaded, station-tight, could follow in immediate sequence. A silent destruction, in silence's worst hour. In the late 1970s, when some U.S. naval architects were restudying Liberty-class weld fragility in freeze-brittle modes, one of the engineers, who had access to the British convoy file, wrote in a footnote, "The lost Norwegian sea convoy demonstrates the pathological scenario. Peak brittle failure aligned with uncommanded maneuver constraint." It is a clinical sentence, but it is the one sentence that unifies the physics, the psychology, the eyewitness silence, and the missing paperwork. Which brings us to the final unanswerable element, the track chart. In 2001, a FOIA request attempted to access all surviving dogleg navigation charts from February 1943. Many charts were produced. All Norwegian sea tracks were provided, except the one that corresponds to this convoy. No trace located. The language is identical to the 1948 inventory list. No trace. It is the same phrase that appears in 3 separate eras of bureaucracy. No trace. There is no supernatural implication in that. Bureaucracies misfile. Corridors change. Drawer labels fade. But in a war where almost everything was documented, the absence of the one chart that shows the one maneuver that placed the convoy inside the storm cell is a factual, unvarnished oddity. And so the mystery remains the most mundane kind, not an espionage plot, not a secret weapon, not a hidden German ambush, but a hole in the world made of paper and weather. The storm, the physics, the brittle steel, all explain the death. But the paper silence explains why the death became myth. The Norwegian Sea did not swallow a conspiracy. It swallowed a convoy, and the records that would prove exactly where slipped after it.